This is Andrew Paul Cronin, and you're listening to the Q&A with A.P.C., the show that features conversations with artists, cultural figures, policymakers, performers, and other innovators living in Virginia. Episode 5, Carine McCandless. In November of 2014, my guest Carine McCandless released her memoir, The Wild Truth. Carine is the sister of Chris McCandless, the 24-year-old who gave away his life savings, hitchhiked across North America, walked into the wilderness of Alaska, and starved to death in 1992. Chris's story received worldwide attention with the release of the book Into the Wild, written by Jon Krakauer. In 2007, Sean Penn wrote and directed a film adaptation of the book. Carine McCandless worked directly with Jon Krakauer and Sean Penn on their projects and shared with them the reasons that drove her brother into the wild, but asked them not to reveal the full story of her troubled and violent home life. More than 20 years after her brother's death, Carine has revealed the whole truth. Her book, The Wild Truth, is a New York Times bestseller and has been released internationally in the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, Italy, and Turkey. A paperback edition of The Wild Truth will be released this November. There was a scene in the movie where Chris at Emory, when he's getting the diploma, he sort of hops up on the podium or on the stage. Mm-hmm. Was that something that happened in real life, that he sort of vaulted himself up on the podium, and then it sort of had this cut scene to your parents?
What you didn't see was what was cut out of the movie. So the long version of the film had Chris, and it was sort of introducing Chris's character as someone who didn't care about formality. You know, like John writes about in Into the Wild, how he didn't take the honors that came with his high GPA, that didn't matter to him. Labels and awards weren't really important to Chris. It wasn't why he did the things that he did. He didn't need that recognition or to prove it to anybody but himself. In the film, Sean kind of gets you into that part of Chris's personality by where everyone else is in their formal regalia and getting ready for this big day and everything that they've been waiting for, and Chris is off and he's running. And so you just see Chris alone running and footsteps on the street, and he basically pushes it to the very last minute to where you don't even think he's going to attend graduation to get his diploma. So on screen, it's cutting back and forth to the graduation ceremony, to Chris alone on the street running, back and forth. And then all of a sudden, you're wondering, is this kid even going to be there? Mm-hmm. And then you see him fly up on stage. Okay. So it was artfully done, but for the sake of not having a 3.5 hour long movie, there were certain things that Sean had to cut out.
But getting a piece of paper would be it would be meaningless. The diploma itself, that piece of paper, would be something that wouldn't have
what it stands for is very important to Chris, but
the tangible.
Yeah, I don't know if he attended graduation for himself. I don't know if he would have attended graduation. I don't like to speak for Chris. You know, I think that it's wrong to do so. That's why in my book I have his letters speak for him. You know, I'll share my opinion about what I believe his opinion would be on something, or I'll state it very clearly if it's something that he said to me or an experience that we had together, something that he shared with me in a personal conversation or in a letter. I feel I knew Chris better than anyone, and there's so many people out there that say, this is what he was thinking, this is what he was doing, this is why he did what he did, and even I don't do that unless it's something he told me himself. So I don't know that he would have attended if we weren't there.
Did he express to you a feeling about the ceremony itself to you, sort of in conversation with you about sort of if it held any importance or not?
In letters and in conversation, yeah. I mean, the formality of that kind of stuff wasn't important to him.
Did Sean talk about sort of what about Chris's story itself sort of drew him in?
Let me think, because of course I don't want to speak for Sean, but with what he shared with me when he told me about, and when he approached the family and why he wanted to do this film, and what he said publicly, I guess the summary that I would say is it struck some very personal things within Sean, just as it struck personal things within John. And I think that, Sean's a very intelligent person, and I think he felt that there was more to the story. He didn't know. Like, John definitely knew there was more to the story. And I think Sean, he sees things visually, whereas I would say, in my opinion, and where I would say John as a writer sees things more for the page, so that's a different kind of process. But I think the romanticism of Chris's story probably was something. I mean, Sean said that he immediately knew he wanted to make it into a movie. Sean isn't one who wants to do projects just because he thinks they're going to sell a lot of tickets. That's sort of the whole business of it is sort of last in line for him. He wants to do purposeful work. I think work that interests him, that he's passionate about. Otherwise, I don't think he would do it. So I think that there were, I could tell that there were things within Chris that just really intrigued Sean personally. And obviously he felt that there was an audience for it.
You have a script supervisor credit for the movie, and you're providing sort of the voiceover narration. And of course, the actress Jenna Malone did the voiceover itself, but how did that work? Were you sending? I mean, did you sit down and write? Was it something that
it's an
you were
interesting
screened?
Story? Actually, one of the first. So Sean came at different times to meet with the family, and then it took 10 years from the very first visit to where we actually had made a decision to move forward with a movie and to go with Sean at that point. I would say that Sean knew. I write about this in my book too. Sean didn't know. I don't think Sean knew how valuable my input was going to be. I think he had a sense of it, but John Krakauer was very clear with him. You need to just sit down and talk to Carine. And he wasn't going to go outside that circle of trust that John and I had, but John and I talked about it a lot. He knew that I was going to be as forthright and open with Sean as I was with John, and even more so because, that much more time had passed, and my experiences with my parents had brought me that much more to the point of finding my voice. Mm-hmm. And at one point, Sean came and we sort of were locked into a hotel that he was working out of there at Town Center, which was, close to me, and we didn't go out in public at all. I kind of said, brace yourself,
Right.
And I think it was a matter of 2 or 3 days. And that was when I allowed him to read Chris's letters and different things. And, sort of, are you ready for all this? Are you sure? Because once it starts, I'm going to be really on you. And I'm going to be really, I have high expectations I just wasn't shy about letting him know what an incredible responsibility he had, and that I was going to hold him to that from a personal standpoint. We had that sort of jam session over, as Sean refers to it. He learned a lot. It was really emotional, but at the same time, I just sort of had this job to do, and I was on a mission, so I tried to keep my emotions out of it. I mean, Sean obviously could sense that from me, but I couldn't break down. I just needed to explain the part of Chris's story that he didn't know. Sometime later, Sean and I kept in touch, and he would either call or email. And I remember him saying, gosh, the script just flew out of me so fast. And he already had a version then, but then he went back in again, and he said everything just flew out of me so fast. And when he sent me his first final, and when you do a film, just like when you're writing a book, there's so many versions. But when he sent me his first final, I opened it up, and I remember, like, one of the first pages, it says Carine VO. And from reading the scripts for Mystic River and the other ones he had sent me, I then understood that VO meant voiceover. And that was the first time he had given me any indication, after all the time we'd spent together in person, that my character was going to be narrating the film. So I called him right away and I said, what the hell is this? I said, you didn't tell me that I was going to be, that my character was going to be doing that. And he said, well, but it has to be you. And I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want he didn't want it to influence
Pressure.
what I was going to share. Yeah. So said to him, all right, you think that I was so anal before about you getting every single thing. If you're going to have words coming out of my mouth, I mean, I don't even know if you want to put up with me to that level. He said, it's fine. This is just an outline here. You're going to write this with me. We're going to involve Jenna. We're going to involve Sharon Olds, who's an incredible Pulitzer Prize winning poet, which she came in for phrasing and just the beauty. I mean, just every part of that movie just flows so beautifully from the cinematography to the narration to everything. And so he brought in all the right people to make that happen. So that's how I even found out. And then after that, he made a promise to me that I would be in the recording studio when Jenna was putting my words to her voice. And he held up to that promise. I mean, at some point in time, I went out to San Francisco, and me and Jenna and Sean and Sharon, along with many other people, were there together kind of hammering it out. Yeah, there's a couple I write about in the book where there's only 2 spots of the whole film that I'm not pleased with. And there's one part of the narration that is not something, when a point came where it was something that Sean really felt was important, but I wouldn't say it that way. Like I don't feel that way.
Yeah.
And he would compromise with me on that of what he felt was important for the audience to hear, but what was the truth and what would really come out of me. So
the other part was the hug at the end.
Yeah, at the end of the film where Chris is dying and you're sort of going through this flashback of like even talking about it right now, I have to take my emotion out of it because to talk about my brother dying and not totally break down is sort of inhuman. But yeah, when I saw that cut, I was very unhappy about it because I just didn't feel that it was fair to Chris. I didn't feel... I mean, I remember saying to Sean that I just felt it was all wrong. I thought, and I was very, I said, you're dishonoring Chris. And Sean never had any intent in any way whatsoever to ever dishonor Chris at all. But I wasn't shy about saying those words. I was just very blunt.
But but in saying those words to Sean, you knew. My guess is that you knew, obviously, the extent to which Sean took the project seriously.
And he had a crazy busy schedule. So if you had something to say, you needed to say it and get to the point. And so I didn't flip flop around on what I was saying. I just said this, And
how did he take that?
Well, I remember in one email I said, this must be changed. And I remember a response from him and said, well, first of all, let's get rid of the word must. Because we had that rapport and I understood that you don't tell Sean Penn that he has to do something. Yet he absolutely understood that it was very important to me because I felt it would be very important to Chris. It wasn't about me. It was about him. He explained to me why that scene was so important to him. I understood that. But I still was just adamant, like that just is not Chris going back in his mind to where he felt so much pain and knowing what his faith was and knowing how I felt and what I thought he would be feeling at that time. I just didn't believe in his mind that he would go back to that place where he had so much pain. Sean said to me, but Carine, you weren't with him when he was dying. And I said, Sean, you're absolutely right, but I knew him and you did not. And I'm telling you with my whole heart, I just don't feel that that's right. Again, Sean didn't have to compromise with me at all. It's his film. It was beautiful, but it shows you the kind of integrity he has. I mean, he came up with the compromise. William Hurt was already filming something else, so he told me, he says, I can't reshoot that. Like, this is what I have to work with. Visually, he wanted to keep that there, but then I write about it in The Wild Truth, how he says, I remember answering the phone at my house, and I can hear Sean's in his car and I can picture him with a cigarette in one hand and the steering wheel in another and papers in his hand and his hair up in this Don King like looking thing that always happened whenever Sean was really working hard and thinking hard about something. He's like, oh, hold on, I got you. Hold on, let me pull over. And he pulls over and then he reads, he says, how about if you hear Emil's voice, Chris's voice come over and say, what if I was smiling and running into your arms, would you see then what I see now? And I'm throwing that out there off the top of my head. I think that's exactly what it says, but I haven't seen the film in years. When he said that to me, it was the perfect compromise because it changes the whole thing. It's fair to my parents. It's fair to Chris. It's fair to Sean.
In the foreword of the book, Krakauer says that he thinks that perhaps you understand Chris better than he understood himself. How do you feel about that? I mean, because that's a really powerful...
I remember reading that in the foreword, and
I mean, it's a huge compliment. But
to me, is that a compliment to Chris?
I don't know.
I mean,
well, that's sort of what I mean.
Yeah.
I don't...
I think that sometimes people have to get outside of themselves, and Chris was almost so intelligent to a fault that he would just wrap his mind around things, and all of us do that. And sometimes when I understood him so well because of the same circumstance that we had, and the conversations that we had, and the things that we kept to ourselves. But then also being able to sort of be on the outside of that. I mean, you could say the same thing. Chris understood me better than I understood myself at that age. He saw the mistakes, and he could tell the things that I was doing, the things I didn't pay enough attention to that I should have, and I could see the same with him. It was completely different. I mean, Chris was smarter than me, and Chris was much more aware than I was, much more self-aware. Those are all lessons that I learned from him and developed later on.
When you hear the name Alexander Supertramp, what do you think of?
It makes me, people say, why did he choose that name? And I've seen people write essays about why Chris chose that name, and they never met him. They never knew him. They never have. And that always is sort of amusing to me. It doesn't upset me because it would just make Chris laugh. I can't tell you why he chose that name.
The name would make him laugh, or the reaction that people have?
No, the name wouldn't make Chris laugh. The fact that people are interpreting that have never met him, that they never had a conversation with, or telling the world why he did this and why he did that. To me, it just sort of makes me giggle because that's that side of Chris that wasn't as serious. You know, it makes complete sense to me. I feel, in my opinion, Chris adopted other name for obvious reasons. You know, Chris McCandless had to die, and by that I don't mean. I mean, Chris was not a suicidal person. He didn't have any desires or intentions of that. And if he did, I would say so. I mean, you know, he didn't give people his real name. All of those things made complete sense to me because he didn't have that identity anymore. He wanted to start new. And Sean does that beautifully in the film.
His favorite backdrop was always nature. Mm-hmm. And as a family, you talked about, you had camping trips and lots of sort of...
Well, that was the only real peaceful time. I mean, it wasn't like the inside. We haven't talked about that yet. I mean, our childhood was wrought with domestic violence, fear, lies, manipulation, and those are things that as a young child you don't understand that that's not the way it's supposed to be and that it's not normal. We were told that violence and turmoil that was going on was due to us. You don't understand until you're much older that this is not my fault. So, but you know, that incredible pressure and tension that you always felt, and you know, not every day wasn't bad, but that tension and pressure was always there. It was gone when we were outdoors. I think that had a huge effect on. I know that had a huge effect on Chris. You know, that's where the peace was. That's where the solace was, and we understood that it was possible for our parents to not have to be that way, and that when they did act that way, that they were making a choice.
Did you ever get the impression that your dad's coworkers or any family friends felt that he was abusive or as unsteady? Never.
Mm-mm. It was.
They had dinner parties with, but no one ever.
There was no indication. I mean, that's why after so many years, I felt it was so important to talk about this and to write this book, to start a new conversation about domestic violence and the devastating effects it has on children and families, and that sometimes you need to look again because it's not always what it looks like and what happens behind closed doors. I mean, we were the perfect family and the perfect kids, and you know, they'd have a lot of high-profile people coming over to the house, and everything was great, and we were so smart, and we were so talented, and they were so proud of us, and they were such a perfect couple. It was just such a show, because up until the curtain came up, until someone came through the door, and then when the last person left the door, it was completely different. Most significantly, growing up in the church and watching our parents teach Sunday school, in our Sunday school class, telling our friends that we would see at school and play with on the playground in the neighborhoods, telling them about God, and then going home and our Father telling us that He is God. So nothing that He is doing to us or our mother is wrong. That, when you grow up like that from the first day you remember as a little kid, and when you're told that these things are your fault, those things stay with you. And I think it's important. I think that's why our story is so relatable, and why it can start that conversation about domestic violence, because we didn't live in a home where the alcohol abuse was prevalent and bad. But, and I write about a couple of other incidents of other substances and things. But, I didn't walk out from the second room of a trailer to my mom shooting up in the living room,
right,
and no education. And I mean, we certainly didn't have the toughest existence, but that's what makes it so relatable. And this book is about, my book is about so much more than just that, but obviously that's an important part of it. It gets people to understand Chris's motivations, that it wasn't just his love of nature that pulled him where he was, but it was this force that drove him away. And you can't know his story in full and understand his motivations without having all of that information.
Chris wrote a letter to your parents where he sort of laid it all out for them about the abuse and the trauma that you suffered as children, and how damaging that was to grow up in a household like that. And their response was a postcard from Colorado, from where they were skiing.
Well, as Chris wrote to me in a letter, of some fancy pants ski resort.
And the response was, "Thanks for your letter, saving them for your children to read one day. Thanks for your letter, saving them for your children."
Thanks for your letter, exclamation point. Saving them for your children to read someday.
And he was looking, and I don't want to speak for him, but my feeling is that he was looking for them to sort of own up to their, to
I
what,
think he was
to what
looking for
their
them
action.
to care. I think this was Chris's last-ditch effort. Chris had made the decision to cut off all contact with his parents.
But that response to that letter where he laid it all out, when in reading,
I think that he felt an obligation to give it one more shot.
Sure.
But I watched all my older brothers. I'm the
yeah.
youngest of 8 kids, and that's a whole other part of the story that people don't know until they read The Wild Truth.
But in reading your book, when it got to that, the question that I had was their reaction, that statement on that postcard from Colorado, that thanks for your letter, saving them for your children to read. Did they really not get it? Do they get it, and it's a self-preservation thing, or do they seriously just not?
I can't speak for them. I can speak for what I've seen time and time again. And actually, I'm going to take a line from John Krakauer, who tried to explain it to me from his own point of view, is they've invented an alternate reality for themselves, and they absolutely believe it. Now, that was his point of view, because as John learned things and saw things and went through his own experiences with them, he was just sort of like, like, how can this be? And then Sean went through the same kind of thing. How can they still be doing this, or how can you see? But they also, have their own respect for them. They lost their son. They certainly deserve empathy for that.
But that answers the question.
Well, to me, I don't cut them that much slack, because I've personally dealt with it for a long time. I believe that they know exactly what they're doing, but some people cannot hold up a mirror and acknowledge the pain. And when they refused, with Chris's last-ditch effort, when they refused to even acknowledge, when you're blamed, Chris was 3 years older than me. So when you're told from a very young age that the problems that exist in your household were due to your existence, and he, knowing he was 3 years older than me, he took that responsibility onto his shoulders. And that's a lot to put on. That's a lot of pressure to put on the shoulders of a little boy. And even though you grow up and you start to understand that that's not the truth, that stayed with him still.
Did they reach out to you? your parents?
No, not every once in a while. I get some sort of very insincere message that lets me know that they are willing to forgive me and are praying for me because I'm surely going to hell. Things like that.
Have they commented
I get the same kind of things that Chris got, that little postcard saying that.
Yes, it's the flipping it.
Yeah.
Have they commented on the book?
Yes, I actually, before The Wild Truth came out, I had a discussion with my publisher, and I wanted them to send a copy of the book to Walt and Billy before it came out, because I felt, they knew I was writing a book.
How'd they know that?
We weren't talking anymore, but I think they found out just from, there was a little buzz in the media world that I was coming out with a book, and I guess that's how they found out. Or we live in the same town, so I didn't really talk much about it. So I assume it must have been from something they read.
Sure.
They haven't said anything directly to me about it, but they released a statement to the media that said my book was fiction and that I had nothing to do with their son. That it was just this hyped up thing. But it doesn't, it's exactly what I expected. It doesn't surprise me. They never understood the damage that they were doing to him or to their family.
When I was reading the book, I felt like you gave your parents a lot of chances as an adult to sort of come around. And was there, other than the parent-child blood relative connection, what made you sort of continuously try to give them so many chances to redeem themselves?
Well, mostly, I thought about this. I mean, I put a lot of thought into this whole thing as I was going through it. I felt a great responsibility as the last child. Again, this devastation. I don't hold Walt and Billy accountable for Chris's death. He put himself into precarious situations. He took his own risks. Chris certainly didn't blame him for his death. He accepted accountability at the end for what was happening to him. But I certainly hold them accountable for his disappearance. They are absolutely the reason, and that is through his own words, that he felt the need to leave the way he did and cut off contact the way he did and push himself to such extremes, which that is what John Krakauer meant by I understood that about Chris even more than he did. Because I don't know that Chris put it together that he pushed himself to such risks because of those things. Like, he was very clear about why he was leaving and how he was going to leave and all of those things.
I felt like you held out hope that they would come around to it, but I didn't always feel
How
like
could they not?
They
How
would.
do you lose your son and not wake up to that and not regain a relationship with your 7 other living children and their children? It's impossible for that not to happen. That is what my view was. And how could I possibly take that last chance for them to make it work, being the youngest, being the only one that still spoke with them? How in the world could I do that to them? That is just wrong. They didn't deserve that. How could I possibly do that?
But I don't feel like they ever really came.
They
with
never
their
did.
own.
And when I became a mother, that's what changed it.
Yeah.
Because I realized that I could not allow what happened to us happen to my daughters.
I don't know if you're comfortable with this question, but do you think about if Chris were alive, what he would be doing now?
Sure.
In terms of family or career?
I think he'd be just like John Krakauer. And people ask me, what would Chris think about the latest political thing, or who he voted for? And, I can't answer questions like that. I can tell you what he respected about President Reagan and those policies, and what parts of him were, liberal, and what parts of him were very conservative because of the things that Chris wrote and the things that Chris talked about. So in a way, when you say, well, what would he be doing today? I can't say, well, this is what he would be doing. But when you tell me, what do I think he'd be a lot like John Krakauer. And every time I say that in John's presence, John blushes, because something that's similar about John and Chris is that neither one of them really understand how remarkable they because they don't really get why everyone doesn't live that way or think that way, right? And maybe John does. I don't want to speak for John, but Chris, I think Chris wouldn't understand what is the big deal, people. Why there's a huge best-selling book about my life and this movie, and I just think it would kind of make him chuckle. Like people like, oh, don't you think he'd be angry because he's so private? I believe wholeheartedly, and I never would have been able to write this book if I didn't believe 100% that what Chris would care about is that people would learn something from it. And I know I did a disservice to Chris by not allowing them to learn more from him through John's book. And so I sort of wanted to correct that and accept responsibility for it. But, I think that he would be similar to John by the way of he would choose a profession that allowed him to live out his adventurous spirit and do work that was purposeful.
Happiness only real when shared. Do you think coming to that conclusion was disappointing for him, or do you think that the idea of discovering that truth, he found comfort in the discovery?
I write about that in the book, and I don't interpret what that meant to Chris.
Okay.
Because people send me tattoos of where they've had that put on their body, and I respect everyone's choice of how they do that. But whenever I reply, I always say, they talk about what it meant to Chris. John's book is required reading in all those high schools and colleges across the country, not to learn about him, but for people to learn more about themselves. Mm-hmm. And so when people choose to, what does it mean to you? What does happiness only real when shared mean to you? And that's why you should be tattooing it on your body, not because of what it meant to Chris. Right. I mean, Chris is this, people tell me all the time that your brother changed my life. And I respect that. I think it's beautiful. But Chris died in 1992. And oftentimes this is coming from people that were born well after that. And Chris cannot do that for you. Chris can't make you make these positive changes in your life. You're doing that for yourself. Take that credit. Now, Chris can be that spark that motivates you to do that. I mean, he has been a spark for me in so many ways, but I have to take ownership of my mistakes and my successes. And I can attribute what I've learned from him to all of that, but ultimately they're my decisions. So when it comes to that, happiness only real when shared, I write about that in the book because what people don't know is, it's John writes about it. It's a very romanticized thing of Sean's when it's in the film, and that's because of what it means to Sean. I write about how when you look at Chris's actual book where he wrote that, and then you turn the next page, where he's written across in some double underline, and it says relationships, those real, those false. And to me, I believe that Chris experienced that, because he put it in the margin, he wrote it on top of this page of one of the books that he was reading. So something moved him to that point in the book, the story that he was reading. Everybody can try to interpret why Chris wrote it and what it meant to him, and that it meant that he realized he didn't want to be alone anymore and he was ready to go back to society and all that. I don't. I knew Chris better than anybody, and I don't do that. I don't say this is what it meant to him. But when you turn the page and it says relationships, those real, those false, I get that. And people don't know that until they read it in my book. And I see that through my knowledge of Chris as both hopeful and cautionary.
You still play the French horn?
Yeah, I still have the same French horn that I played, and it's in my office hanging up on the wall. I take it off every once in a while.
Can you still play?
I can still play the French horn pretty well.
That's good.
I've got a keyboard, and I don't play the piano very well anymore. I have these incredible visions of having a year off.
To hone the skills.
And because I was a good musician, and I was so passionate about that, and I think I could have taken that road too. But and it's a gift, to be able to be able to do that. And I sort of have kind of tossed that gift aside in priority to other things. I'm envious of my friends from high school that are still doing that and are doing it so well, and I'm so happy for them. And it wasn't my path, But yeah, I have these romantic visions of self-romantic visions of me having a year off at some point in time to where I can just focus on my music again. And
The red Corvette that you restored, where is that car now?
the old Corvette was raffled off to benefit a local charity that helps advocate for children and adults with mental disabilities. The guy that won it was a veteran, still doing it, but had been a long time with the EMT services. So, someone that had given back to
Sure.
the community for so long, and, he bought a ticket and won it, and it was pretty cool. But yes, I miss it on sunny days.
It was convertible.
I don't regret the decision. It was convertible. Yet, when I owned my auto repair shop, I had a lot of military guys and pilots that had, RX-7s for one, they always seem to have, but old Corvettes as well.
Those rotary RX-7 engines were notorious for...
Well, you can't let them sit.
Yeah.
They have, gosh, am I even going to remember my terminology anymore because I sold my shop in 2003, but the apex seals, they had, triangular cylinders, unlike the typical round cylinders of like a Chevy V8 or something. And you'd have these apex seals at the corners, and if you didn't run it, they would... get hard and brittle, and then they couldn't build up compression. And so, I'd tell these guys with their RX-7s, you need to, get your girl or someone to run that thing.
Go run it.
Yeah, it's okay for them to drive it, take it to the grocery store. And also the, like the brake calipers, their rotors would be warped all the time because pilots would have it and they would go so fast and stop and go fast and stop. But with the old Corvettes, you had like, say, a Rochester quadrajet carburetor, and you'd have... and the calipers on old Corvettes are notorious for leaking, the brake calipers, if it sits and you don't use it. And, when I had my kids, I wasn't strapping car seats into a 1969 made of fiberglass car. I mean, sure, was it cool to drive? Of course. But I'm not knocking people that put their kids in those things.
No,
But
right,
it was not a choice
Sure.
of mine. I wanted my girls in... something that had 80 airbags in it, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it sat, and it didn't deserve to sit. It deserved to be driven. So someone won it through that charity, and I'm sure it's out on the road and happy now.
Do you miss the shop?
I do.
Yeah.
I knew that it was the right decision because I had a fantastic shop, a huge loyal customer base. I knew that I could have held on to that shop and had it as an income stream. And I had great employees that were very trustworthy and would have done a fantastic job. And even when I sat down and talked to them about the fact that I wanted to sell it and I wanted their support in that decision, I remember a couple of them saying, well, gosh, we can run it.
Mm-hmm.
And they absolutely could have, but I'm not good at that. Like, I know my personality is one that would need to be there. I know my weaknesses, and one is that I could never be a franchise owner of 20 businesses or restaurants all over because I'm just...
You would need to be in 20 places at once.
I don't delegate well,
Right.
and I don't... It's not that I don't think they can do it, but are they really going to do it the way I want to do it? And what if something happens and my name's on it? And it's too stressful for me.
The Wild Truth was released in November 2014 and became a New York Times bestseller. And it's been published internationally, United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, Italy, Turkey, and in 2016, February, in France. You've traveled with the book, obviously, on tours. Have you traveled internationally with the book yet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to Italy.
Do you find that people in different countries relate to different things from country to country, or is it all...
That's what, through John's brilliant writing and retelling of Chris's story from his perspective, and then I see it continuing with people reading my book, which is such a honor. Those lessons and what people get from Chris's story, it's timeless. I mean, it's been 20 years now. People are reading the book who were born after Chris passed away, and it has as great as an effect. People who come from dysfunctional families, there's so many levels of dysfunction, of course. Nobody's family is perfect, but whether they do or do not, there's something in Chris's story that everybody relates to, and a lot of it is it makes them think. It makes them think about their own lives, their priorities, their own paths. That's something that I talk to students about all the time. What is your true path? Are you following one that is truly yours or one that's laid out for you? Are you studying in college what you were told you were good at? Are you really going to be passionate about this? Is this what you really want to do? And oftentimes they're afraid to kind of cross over that line of what's expected of them or what is the easier path. But what's really going to truly make them happy? And isn't that the point? Are we here to exist or are we here to truly live? And although Chris died so young, and there's so much tragedy in that, he lived. He truly lived his life, and he died at peace. Even though he died so young and he loved life so much and he was devastated to be dying, I can tell you that from reading his journal and knowing him. But he still was able to die at peace because of the paths that he chose in his life and knowing that that was his true path. I mean, Chris's story goes beyond geography and it goes beyond ethnicity and culture and all, there's...
It's human.
Yeah, exactly. It brings us all back down to what we are, and we're all human.
There are not many people that would have the courage to do what you did, not only to write the book, but to sort of put yourself on the line, to answer questions about it. I wish you all the best. I appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
It meant a lot.
Thanks.
This is Andrew Paul Cronin, and you've been listening to the Q&A with A.P.C. To hear archived episodes, go to soundcloud.com/QAAPC or subscribe to the show on iTunes. For exclusive content, including upcoming shows, behind-the-scenes pictures, and more, follow the show on Instagram at instagram.com/QAAPC. The executive producer of the Q&A with A.P.C. is Ben Riley.